Of course. Here is the paraphrased script, maintaining your original tone and articulate style while slightly altering the word order and sentence structure. Asterisk asterisk asterisk. In the summer of 1847, a discovery was made by construction workers renovating a decaying mansion outside Savannah, Georgia, a discovery that would send shock waves through the highest circles of Southern society. Wrapped in oilcloth and hidden beneath floorboards in what had once been the master bedroom, they found a leather-bound journal. Its pages were filled with meticulous handwriting documenting something so disturbing that 3 of the workers immediately quit, leaving town without collecting their final wages. The journal had belonged to Colonel Beauregard Ashworth, a decorated war hero whose family, for 3 generations, had controlled thousands of acres of prime cotton land. But what those pages revealed about his wedding gift to his young bride would expose a conspiracy of calculated evil, a conspiracy that reached into governors' mansions, judges' chambers, and the drawing rooms of America's most respected families. For over 150 years, this story has been buried by powerful interests working to keep it hidden. Tonight, the truth about the pact that destroyed one of the South's most prominent dynasties is what we're going to uncover. Hello everyone. Before we begin, be sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment telling us where you're from and what time you're watching. This way, YouTube will continue to show you stories just like this one. Throughout antebellum Georgia, the name Ashworth commanded reverence like few others. The embodiment of everything Southern aristocracy aspired to become was Colonel Beauregard Ashworth, a towering figure whose military exploits in the Mexican-American War had earned him medals, land grants, and political connections of the kind that could make or break entire communities with a single conversation. Steel-gray eyes that seemed to peer directly into men's souls were set in the face of a man standing 6 feet 4 inches, a man who possessed the bearing of someone born to command. With the authority of a man who had never been questioned, never been denied, his voice carried across vast plantation grounds, a man who had never encountered resistance he couldn't crush through sheer force of will. Someone whose intelligence was matched only by his absolute conviction that certain people existed solely to serve his interests was how those who knew him described him. Nearly 4,000 acres of Georgia's most fertile soil were sprawled across by the Ashworth plantation, worked by over 300 enslaved souls whose ancestors, through generations of unpaid labor, had built the family's fortune. But Beauregard maintained obsessively detailed records on every individual, unlike other plantation owners who viewed their human property simply as economic assets, their bloodlines, their skills, their psychological profiles, and, most chillingly, their estimated breaking points based on careful observation and experimentation. Everything a Southern gentleman could desire in a wife was represented by his bride-to-be. From Charleston's most distinguished family came Miss Evangeline Mortimer, possessing not only the refined education expected of a lady, but also an inheritance that would double the Ashworth holdings overnight. The sons of senators and the nephews of governors had courted her at 22. Yet for reasons that went far deeper than his wealth or social standing, she had chosen Beauregard. An unusual fascination with what she called the science of human management was displayed by Evangeline during their courtship, which was conducted through formal visits and carefully supervised walks through Ashworth's meticulously maintained gardens. While other ladies of her station concerned themselves with household supervision and social obligations, she asked penetrating questions about labor productivity, psychological motivation, and the techniques required to extract maximum efficiency from reluctant workers. Both impressed and intrigued by her analytical mind, Beauregard found himself. Here was a woman who understood that more than simply owning land and workers was required for plantation success. A sophisticated understanding of human psychology and the systematic application of pressure designed to break resistance before it could form were what it demanded. A calculating intelligence that viewed human suffering as a puzzle to be solved rather than a tragedy to be avoided was what their conversations revealed, an intelligence concealed by her beauty and charm. Not merely through cotton cultivation had Evangeline's father, Judge Cornelius Mortimer, built his fortune, but through what he euphemistically called human capital optimization, buying, selling, and breeding enslaved individuals across multiple states with the same cold efficiency other men applied to livestock trading. A world where human beings were evaluated, categorized, and disposed of according to market calculations was where she had grown up. Their pain and terror were merely unfortunate byproducts of necessary business operations. The union of two great dynasties was how their engagement announcement in the spring of 1847 was celebrated, a union promising to create a plantation empire that would dominate Georgia's political and economic landscape for generations to come. To powerful families from Virginia to Louisiana, invitations to their October wedding went out, with preparations beginning for a celebration that would establish new standards for Southern aristocratic excess. But a request from Evangeline as the wedding approached would set in motion events that would ultimately consume everything the Ashworth family had built over 3 generations. On a sweltering September evening in Bogaard's private study, the conversation that would seal the Ashworth family's doom took place. A sanctuary lined with military commendations, family portraits stretching back 5 generations, and meticulously organized ledgers documenting every aspect of his plantation empire. Outside, thunder rolled across cotton fields heavy with the promise of another profitable harvest, while inside, his bride-to-be prepared to make a request that no Southern lady had ever dared voice aloud. With perfect posture, Evangeline sat in the leather chair across from his mahogany desk, her delicate hands folded in her lap, her voice carrying the musical cadence that had charmed Charleston's most eligible bachelors. But an undertone that made something cold crawl up Beauregard's spine despite the oppressive heat was carried by her words. "My dearest Beauregard," she began, her smile never wavering, even as her eyes took on a calculating gleam that belonged more in a counting house than a lady's parlor. "I have been contemplating how I might contribute most effectively to our household's prosperity after our union. Far more valuable than traditional wifely duties are capabilities that I believe I possess." A proposal so methodically planned, so clinically presented, followed that Beauregard found himself simultaneously horrified and fascinated by the woman he thought he knew. Complete legal ownership of 7 specific enslaved individuals was what Evangeline wanted, not household servants, but a carefully selected group she had been observing and evaluating for months. With the detached precision of a scientist choosing laboratory specimens, she produced a leather portfolio filled with detailed notes about each person, notes written in her elegant script but containing observations that would have made hardened overseers uncomfortable. A family unit, parents Marcus and Sarah Whitfield, their 3 adult children, and 2 grandchildren aged 8 and 10, consisted of the group. But far beyond their labor value or family connections went Evangeline's interest in them. "These 7 represent perfect test subjects for methodologies I have been researching," she explained, her voice maintaining the same pleasant tone she used when discussing flower arrangements or menu planning. "Techniques for human management that could revolutionize our entire approach to labor extraction are what I have learned through correspondence with plantation managers in Cuba and Brazil. Systematic psychological torture designed not merely to ensure obedience but to completely shatter the human spirit was what the methods Evangeline described with such clinical enthusiasm involved. She spoke of controlled starvation cycles that would condition subjects to view food as a privilege rather than a necessity, isolation techniques that would destroy family bonds, replacing them with absolute loyalty to their masters, and punishment systems that would create such terror that the mere possibility of disobedience would trigger psychological collapse. With growing unease, Beauregard listened as his refined, educated bride outlined her vision with the same methodical precision other women applied to household management. Something else entirely was what she proposed, a systematic program designed to reduce human beings to nothing more than perfectly obedient tools. Yet despite his discomfort, he found himself intrigued. Cotton prices had been fluctuating unpredictably, and plantation owners throughout Georgia were searching for ways to increase efficiency while reducing costs. The most profitable operation in the state could be established if Evangeline's methods proved successful on a small scale, potentially being applied across his entire workforce to create productivity levels that would make the Ashworth plantation dominant. Over several nights of increasingly disturbing discussions, what Evangeline called the Mortimer Protocol was developed by them, a comprehensive system for breaking human resistance so completely that rebellion would become psychologically impossible. As proof of concept, the 7 chosen subjects would serve, their responses carefully documented to determine whether the methods warranted expansion across the entire plantation after their wedding. Extraordinary discretion and the services of an attorney willing to handle documents that pushed the boundaries of what even antebellum law considered acceptable were required for the legal arrangements. For managing sensitive plantation legal matters with absolute confidentiality and flexible moral boundaries, Hamilton Blackwood, a Charleston lawyer known for these traits, was retained by Bogard. Papers that would transfer complete ownership of the 7 individuals to Evangeline upon marriage were drawn up by Blackwood, with provisions ensuring the arrangement remained hidden from other plantation owners, local authorities, and even Bogard's own overseers. A particularly sinister clause that Evangeline insisted upon was included in the documents. The subjects would be relocated to a specially constructed facility where her experiments could proceed without interference or observation from the plantation's other workers. That his bride's unusual request represented innovative thinking rather than calculated sadism was what Bogard convinced himself of as October approached. Through strategic risks and forward-thinking investments, he had built his fortune, qualities he now recognized in the woman who would become his partner in more than marriage. A business partnership designed to revolutionize plantation management throughout the South would be created by their union, not just a social alliance. That their scientific approach to human suffering would create something far more dangerous than broken, obedient workers was what neither of them anticipated. That systematic torture might forge its victims into something they had never encountered before, people with absolutely nothing left to lose, and every reason to seek methodical, calculated revenge was what they failed to consider in their arrogance. With the kind of crystalline autumn beauty that made Georgia seem like paradise itself, October 12, 1847, dawned. Into a wonderland of white magnolia blossoms and golden silk ribbons had the Ashworth plantation been transformed, with elaborate pavilions erected across the mansion's sprawling grounds to accommodate what would become the most talked-about wedding celebration in the state's history. Since dawn, carriages bearing the South's most powerful families had been arriving, creating a procession of wealth and influence that stretched for miles along the dusty country roads. Governors, senators, Supreme Court justices, and plantation owners whose combined holdings could influence legislation from Washington to New Orleans were among the 300 guests. Radiant in imported Parisian silk and Belgian lace, Evangeline stood during the ceremony in the mansion's grand ballroom, while Beauregard stood resplendent in his ceremonial military uniform, medals gleaming across his chest like captured starlight. But during the traditional gift presentation ceremony, the true significance of this day would emerge when Southern custom demanded that the groom publicly announce his wedding present to his bride. With the same strategic precision he had once applied to military campaigns, Bogard had planned this moment, understanding that his gift would be discussed in drawing rooms and gentlemen's clubs from Virginia to Texas for years to come. Rising before the assembled crowd of the South's most influential families, Beauregard called for silence with the commanding presence that had once rallied soldiers on Mexican battlefields. Clearly across the ballroom, his voice carried as he began what would become the most infamous wedding speech in Georgia's history. Distinguished friends and honored guests, he announced, his words carefully chosen to convey both tradition and innovation. Jewels, fine art, or perhaps imported luxuries from distant lands are what it is customary for a bridegroom to present his beloved with. But something far more practical and forward-thinking, a gift that reflects her remarkable intelligence and her commitment to advancing our family's prosperity through scientific management, is what my extraordinary wife has requested. With rapt attention, the crowd listened as Bogard described his unprecedented wedding gift, the complete legal ownership of 7 carefully selected individuals chosen specifically for what he termed experimental applications of advanced plantation management techniques. Eloquently, he spoke of his bride's analytical mind and her desire to contribute actively to their agricultural empire through innovative approaches to labor optimization. A respected war hero praising his wife's business acumen and entrepreneurial spirit was what the distinguished guests heard. That at that very moment, armed overseers were forcibly separating the 7 members of the Whitfield family from everything they had ever known, transporting them to a specially constructed building where Evangeline's experiments would begin immediately following the wedding celebration, was what they could not have known. Overwhelmingly positive was the reaction among the guests, with several prominent plantation owners approaching Bogard throughout the evening to inquire about the specific methodologies his wife intended to employ. A brilliant adaptation to changing economic conditions and increasing competition from Western territories was how the concept of involving educated Southern ladies more directly in plantation management struck many. On his wife's progressive thinking, Governor Milford himself congratulated Beauregard, while Senator Carmichael expressed interest in implementing similar programs on his own properties. That systematic study could potentially revolutionize agricultural efficiency throughout the entire region was noted by Judge Morrison, who praised the scientific approach to human management. However, not everyone present viewed the announcement with such enthusiasm. By the clinical language used to describe human beings as experimental subjects, Dr. Thaddeus Blackwell, the county physician who had treated enslaved individuals on dozens of plantations, found himself deeply disturbed. Similarly, Reverend Joshua Peaton recognized something fundamentally wrong with treating marriage gifts as opportunities for what sounded suspiciously like systematic torture. As the evening progressed and expensive champagne flowed freely, additional details that should have alarmed more guests than they actually did were provided by Evangeline herself. With genuine excitement, she spoke about eliminating counterproductive emotional attachments and establishing new psychological frameworks for absolute compliance. With the same melodious charm she used when discussing fashion or social events, her words were delivered, making their sinister implications easy for intoxicated listeners to dismiss or overlook. For 3 days, the wedding celebration continued as planned, with elaborate dinners, dancing, and entertainment that would be remembered as one of the finest social gatherings in the region's history. But while guests enjoyed themselves in the mansion's elegant ballrooms and manicured gardens, something far more sinister had already begun in the remote facility where 7 terrified human beings faced the beginning of Evangeline's scientific program. According to Evangeline's detailed specifications, the building that would become their prison had been constructed during the summer months, disguised as an expanded cotton processing facility to avoid attracting unwanted attention. But inside, with the cold efficiency of someone who had studied every aspect of human psychology and physical endurance, it had been designed, creating spaces specifically engineered to break spirits and destroy hope. While wedding guests toasted the happy couple and danced until dawn, Marcus and Sarah Whitfield held their grandchildren close for what they somehow knew would be the last time, understanding with the terrible clarity that comes from a lifetime of suffering that they had become victims of something far worse than ordinary plantation brutality. What happened when educated, refined people applied scientific methodology to the systematic destruction of human souls was what they were about to discover. 2 miles from the main plantation house, the facility that Evangeline had constructed for her research sat, connected by a winding path that disappeared into dense Georgia pine forest like a trail leading straight into hell itself. Something far more sinister was what had been presented to local authorities as an expanded cotton processing building, a carefully designed laboratory for human suffering that would have impressed the most creative minds in history's darkest chapters. The appearance of agricultural functionality was maintained by the structure's exterior, but inside, every room had been constructed according to specifications that Evangeline had developed through months of correspondence with plantation managers in Cuba and Brazil, men who had pioneered techniques considered too extreme even by antebellum Southern standards. Reinforced walls designed to contain screams, barred windows positioned too high to provide any view of the outside world, and a series of isolation chambers where individual subjects could be held in complete sensory deprivation for weeks at a time were featured in the building. Most disturbing was what Evangeline called her conditioning center, a large room equipped with restraining devices, punishment apparatus, and observation platforms that allowed her to document her subjects' responses with the detached precision of a natural scientist studying laboratory specimens. To maximize psychological impact while avoiding the kind of obvious physical damage that might attract unwanted attention from neighboring plantations or traveling authorities, everything had been designed. 3 generations of people who had served the plantation community for over 40 years were represented by the 7 members of the Whitfield family who became Evangeline's first test subjects. Valuable skills as a carpenter and herbalist respectively were possessed by Marcus and Sarah Whitfield, both in their 50s. While their 3 adult children, Thomas, age 30, Rebecca, 28, and Joshua, 25, had been trained in various plantation tasks and were considered among the most reliable workers on the property. The family unit that Evangeline had selected for reasons that went far beyond their practical value was completed by Rebecca's 2 children, ages 8 and 10. Their reputation for strong emotional bonds and mutual support during difficult times was what made this family particularly suited to Evangeline's purposes. That systematically destroying these family connections would result in more compliant, Productive workers who would focus entirely on their assigned tasks rather than maintaining relationships that might interfere with absolute obedience to their masters was what her research had convinced her of. What she termed psychological isolation protocols designed to sever the communication and support systems that had sustained the family through previous hardships was where Evangeline's methodology began. To separate living quarters was each individual assigned, and forbidden from any contact with other family members except during carefully supervised work periods when they were monitored constantly by specially trained overseers. These weren't ordinary plantation overseers, but men selected specifically for their capacity for cruelty and their complete isolation from the plantation's social networks. From distant locations, Evangeline had recruited them, offering extraordinary compensation in exchange for absolute secrecy and unquestioning compliance with her experimental protocols. That might create conflicts of loyalty if they were required to participate in activities that exceeded normal punishment standards was family connections or community ties that neither man had. To deliberately fabricated information designed to create mistrust and suspicion among family members, the psychological manipulation extended. Evangeline would inform Marcus that his son Thomas had spoken critically about his father's work performance, while simultaneously telling Thomas that his father had requested additional punishment for his alleged laziness and disrespect. That gradually eroded the trust and affection that had sustained the family through decades of hardship were tensions and doubts created by these calculated lies. But what she called competitive suffering was Evangeline's most innovative technique. Against each other in various tasks were family members forced to compete, with the understanding that superior performance by one individual would result in better treatment, while inferior performance would bring punishment not just to the underperformer but to randomly selected family members as well. Into a source of fear and guilt was this system transforming natural family loyalty, as each person's actions directly affected the welfare of those they loved most. Ideal conditions for Evangeline's program were provided by winter, as shorter daylight hours meant longer periods of confinement and reduced possibilities for outside contact or observation. Of each subject's responses to her various techniques, she maintained meticulous written records, documenting changes in behavior, productivity levels, and signs of psychological breakdown with the same clinical precision she had once applied to managing her father's household finances. Deliberately harsh but carefully calculated to avoid immediate life-threatening consequences were the physical conditions in the facility. That dead or seriously injured subjects would provide no useful data and might attract unwanted investigation from other plantation workers or unexpected visitors was understood by Evangeline. Instead, she focused on creating constant discomfort and uncertainty that would gradually wear down psychological resistance without leaving obvious evidence of systematic mistreatment. To maintain basic health while creating perpetual hunger that could be manipulated as both punishment and reward, food rations were precisely calculated. To prevent rest and recovery with thin mattresses, inadequate blankets, and deliberately uncomfortable positioning that left subjects exhausted and more susceptible to psychological manipulation, sleeping arrangements were designed. Daily, Evangeline visited her experimental subjects throughout the winter months, always accompanied by her two trusted overseers, and sometimes bringing along a leather-bound journal where she recorded her observations with the enthusiasm of a botanist documenting new species. To assess their psychological state, observe their responses to her various techniques, and adjust her methods based on what she perceived as successful or unsuccessful approaches, she would interview each individual separately. That her systematic cruelty was creating something far more dangerous than broken, obedient workers was what Evangeline failed to recognize. Instead of breaking them, her torture was forging them into something she had never encountered and could not have imagined: a coordinated unit with nothing left to lose and every reason to seek methodical, calculated revenge against those who had destroyed their lives. Through the slave quarters of the main plantation, like whispers carried on winter wind, rumors about the mysterious building and its 7 missing occupants had begun circulating by February 1848. For decades, the Whitfield family had been respected members of the community, known for their skills, their strong family bonds, and their willingness to help others during times of illness or crisis. An atmosphere of fear and dread that hung over the plantation like a suffocating blanket had been created by their sudden disappearance and the strict prohibition against discussing their whereabouts. Quietly gathering information about what had happened to the missing family began Mamiah, an elderly woman who had served as the unofficial spiritual leader of the enslaved community for over 30 years. Opportunities to overhear conversations between Beauregard, his new wife, and their increasingly frequent visitors, other plantation owners who came seeking details about Evangeline's innovative management techniques, were provided by her position as head seamstress in the main house. A picture that exceeded even her worst fears about the cruelties that white people could inflict upon those they owned was what Mama Celia learned through careful observation and discreet inquiries. A story of systematic torture designed not merely to punish but to completely destroy the human spirit was told by the supplies that had been delivered to the remote building throughout the winter months. Medical instruments that seemed designed for inflicting precise pain rather than providing treatment, restraining devices that appeared far more sophisticated than typical plantation punishment equipment, and large quantities of materials that suggested extended confinement rather than temporary disciplinary measures were what she had observed wagons carrying. But perhaps most disturbing were the sounds that could occasionally be heard from the direction of the remote facility during the deep silence of winter nights. From several plantation workers came reports of hearing screams that lasted for hours, followed by periods of absolute quiet that somehow seemed more ominous than the obvious sounds of suffering. These were not the cries of people being whipped or beaten in the heat of anger, but something else entirely, the methodical, calculated sounds of human beings being systematically broken through scientific application of terror and pain. What she called prayer gatherings, secret meetings where enslaved individuals would come together to share information, offer emotional support, and discuss their growing fears about what might happen to any of them if they attracted Evangeline's attention, was what Mama Celia began organizing. Beyond their obvious spiritual function, these meetings served multiple purposes. They facilitated the exchange of crucial survival information, fostered a sense of unity that had previously been prevented by the plantation's size and the diverse backgrounds of its workers, and began to create something that had never existed before on the Ashworth plantation: a coordinated resistance network. A comprehensive picture of Evangeline's activities that went far beyond what wedding guests had heard described as scientific management techniques emerged through these gatherings. Systematic torture designed to break not just individual will, but the very capacity for independent thought or emotional connection to other human beings was what reports from those who had observed the building from safe distances suggested. A means of preserving information that might otherwise be lost or forgotten if those who possessed it were sold to other plantations or simply disappeared were the prayer meetings also served. That detailed accounts of everything they learned about the missing family be memorized by multiple individuals was insisted upon by Mama Celia, ensuring that evidence of what was happening would survive even if those who gathered it were punished or eliminated. Into something more active than mere information sharing and emotional support, these gatherings began to evolve as winter slowly gave way to spring. A sense of urgency that overcame the caution and resignation that typically characterized plantation life under even the harshest conditions had been created by the realization that the Whitfield family's fate could befall any of them at any time. Meanwhile, unknown to the terrified community discussing their fate in whispered conversations, a transformation that neither Evangeline nor anyone else could have anticipated had been undergone by the 7 members of the Whitfield family. Rather than becoming broken, compliant subjects ready for integration back into the plantation's general labor force, they had evolved into something far more dangerous: a coordinated unit whose every thought focused on a single objective, ensuring that their tormentors would pay for what they had done. With Thomas Whitfield, the eldest son, whose natural intelligence and leadership abilities had made him a particular target for Evangeline's psychological manipulation techniques, the transformation had begun. Something cold and calculating inside him had been forged instead by repeated attempts to break his spirit through isolation, starvation, and watching his family members suffer, a mind that focused entirely on finding ways to strike back against those who had destroyed everything he loved. Working in enforced isolation, deprived of communication with his relatives, Thomas had spent the winter months memorizing every detail of the facility's layout, the routines of the overseers, and the patterns of Evangeline's visits. He had observed which doors remained unlocked at different times, where tools and potential weapons were stored, and how sound carried between different sections of the building. More importantly, he had found ways to communicate with his family members despite Evangeline's elaborate isolation protocols. Through a system of coded tapping sounds, hidden messages scratched into wood surfaces, and carefully timed gestures during supervised work periods, Contact had been maintained and their responses to their captors' demands begun to be coordinated by the Whitfield family. The development of a sophisticated conspiracy focused on a single, desperate objective was what appeared to outsiders as the gradual breakdown of family bonds. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? The breaking point was approaching fast, and when it came, it would transform the Ashworth plantation from a symbol of Southern prosperity into something that would haunt the nightmares of everyone who learned the truth about what had been done in the name of scientific progress and agricultural efficiency. With the kind of deceptive tranquility that often precedes the most violent storms, the morning of March 20, 1848, dawned. Early in Georgia had spring arrived, filling the air with the sweet scent of blooming dogwood and the promise of another profitable cotton season. With the same methodical routine she had maintained throughout the winter months, Evangeline Ashworth began her day, breakfast with her husband in the mansion's elegant dining room, followed by collection of her observation notes and preparation for what she had planned as the culmination of her experimental program. The beginning of what she called final integration testing, the process by which her 7 subjects would be gradually reintroduced to the plantation's general population to demonstrate the effectiveness of her psychological conditioning techniques, was what today would mark living proof that systematic torture could transform rebellious, independently minded individuals into perfectly obedient workers would be served by the Whitfield family. But as Evangeline walked along the familiar path through the pine forest toward the remote facility, she was unaware that for this exact moment, the 7 people she believed she had broken into submission had spent months preparing. Everything she could devise had been endured by them: starvation, isolation, watching their loved ones suffer, psychological manipulation designed to destroy their sanity and their humanity. Instead of breaking them, her cruelty had forged them into something she had never encountered and could not have imagined: people who had moved beyond fear, beyond hope, beyond anything except the burning need for justice. A scene that would be burned into the nightmares of everyone who witnessed it for the rest of their lives, was what Evangeline discovered when she reached the building. In the main conditioning room lay the 2 specially selected overseers, dead, killed not in a frenzy of desperate violence, but through the systematic application of techniques that demonstrated both careful planning and intimate knowledge of human anatomy. Neither quick nor merciful had their deaths been. They had been subjected to the same methodical torture they had inflicted on others, administered with the precision of people who had learned exactly how much pain the human body could endure. But far more disturbing than the deaths themselves was the evidence of systematic preparation that surrounded the bodies. Into something very different from what Evangeline had intended, had the Whitfield family used their months of confinement to transform the facility. Tools had been converted into weapons, escape routes had been prepared, and supplies had been gathered for what was clearly a carefully orchestrated confrontation rather than a spontaneous act of rebellion. Most chilling of all was the realization that the 7 individuals she had believed were psychologically shattered had instead been watching her, learning her routines, studying her vulnerabilities, and preparing for this moment with the same clinical precision she had used to design their suffering. They had become students of her methods, and now they were ready to demonstrate what they had learned. In the center of the room that had been the site of so much agony stood Thomas Whitfield. No longer the broken victim Evangeline believed she had created, but someone whose intelligence and determination had been focused entirely on survival and retribution. With him stood his family, arranged not in the random positions of desperate people, but in the coordinated formation of individuals who had planned every detail of what would happen next. "Mistress Evangeline," Thomas said, his voice carrying none of the deference and terror that months of torture were supposed to have instilled. "We have been expecting you. We have something important to show you." Not a conversation in any normal sense, but rather the methodical presentation of a comprehensive case that the Whitfield family had prepared during their months of systematic abuse was what followed. Every aspect of Evangeline's experimental program had been documented by them, every detail of her techniques memorized, and a complete account of what had been done to them and why prepared. But far beyond simply confronting their tormentor with evidence of her cruelty extended their purpose. As a prototype for methods that would be implemented across multiple plantations throughout the region was what the Whitfield family had realized Evangeline's program was intended. Their suffering had been designed to establish techniques that would be applied to thousands of other enslaved individuals, creating a system of psychological control so complete that resistance would become literally impossible to conceive. Not just about personal revenge was their confrontation with Evangeline. It was about ensuring that her methods would never be used to destroy other families. Something far more dangerous than a rebellious slave had Thomas Whitfield become. Through months of systematic torture, he had evolved into someone who understood exactly how the plantation system functioned, who could anticipate the responses of authorities to slave rebellion, and who had developed a comprehensive strategy not just for escape, but for ensuring that evidence of Evangeline's experiments would reach people capable of preventing similar programs from being implemented elsewhere. The calculated administration of justice by individuals who had been transformed by their suffering into something their captors had never anticipated and could not control was what the confrontation that morning was, not the desperate violence of people with nothing left to lose. When Evangeline's screams finally ended hours later, the manner of her death would tell a story that authorities would spend decades trying to suppress, and that would haunt the dreams of everyone who learned the truth. But far beyond personal retribution extended the Whitfield family's plan. Evidence had been prepared by them, documentation gathered, and contacts established that would ensure their story reached individuals beyond the local authorities who might be motivated to cover up scandals that could damage the reputation of prominent plantation families. By the time Bogard Ashworth discovered what remained of his wife, forces that would transform their private nightmare into a public reckoning that would destroy everything the family had built over 3 generations had already been set in motion. Results she never intended had been produced by the laboratory of human suffering that Evangeline had created with such scientific precision, not broken, obedient workers, but people who had learned her methods so thoroughly that they could apply them with devastating effectiveness against those who had wielded them first. At approximately 3 o'clock on the afternoon of March the 20th, Colonel Bogard Ashworth discovered the remains of his wife and her experimental program, when her failure to return from the remote facility had finally overcome his reluctance to investigate personally. What he found in that carefully constructed laboratory of human suffering would shatter not only his understanding of the woman he had married, but the entire foundation upon which his family's legacy had been built for 3 generations. In the center of what had once been her conditioning room lay Evangeline's body, surrounded by the meticulously organized evidence of her systematic torture program. But this was not the scene of random violence that might be expected from a desperate slave rebellion. Instead, Beauregard encountered something far more terrifying: the methodical documentation and presentation of evidence that revealed the true scope of his wife's activities and their devastating consequences. Into what could only be described as a comprehensive exhibition of cruelty, had the facility itself been transformed, with every tool, every restraining device, and every psychological manipulation technique carefully arranged and labeled to demonstrate the systematic nature of Evangeline's experimental program. In a manner that would leave no doubt about the deliberate, calculated nature of what had been done to the 7 members of the Whitfield family, written documentation, including his wife's own detailed observation notes, had been organized and presented. Most disturbing of all was a comprehensive written account, obviously prepared over many weeks, that detailed not only what had been endured by the missing family, but Evangeline's correspondence with other plantation owners throughout Georgia, South Carolina, and Alabama, who had expressed interest in implementing similar programs on their own properties. That what Bogard had understood as an isolated experiment was actually intended as the foundation for a regional transformation of plantation management techniques was revealed by the document. Completely had the Whitfield family themselves vanished, leaving behind only the evidence of their months of torture and a clear indication that their escape had been planned with the same systematic precision that characterized everything else about their final confrontation with their tormentors. Only what they needed for survival had they taken, destroyed nothing beyond what was necessary to eliminate their captives, and left behind a complete record that would make any cover-up attempt extraordinarily difficult. But perhaps most chilling was the evidence of how Evangeline had died. To a carefully planned demonstration of her own experimental techniques, had the Whitfield family subjected her, administered with the clinical precision she had used to torture others. Experiencing every method she had developed for breaking the human spirit, had her final hours been spent, applied by people who had intimate knowledge of her procedures and unlimited motivation to ensure she understood exactly how her victims had suffered. Preventing this discovery from becoming public knowledge that would destroy not only his own reputation, but the standing of every plantation owner who had been associated with Evangeline's program was Bogaud's immediate concern. Within hours of finding his wife's remains, trusted riders had been dispatched by him to contact other members of the planter elite who needed to be warned about the potential scandal and enlisted in efforts to control the narrative that was already beginning to spread beyond his ability to contain. Swift and coordinated was the response, involving some of the most powerful families in the antebellum South. By evening, representatives from influential dynasties across 3 states had arrived at the Ashworth plantation to assess the situation and develop strategies for preventing the truth about Evangeline's experimental program from reaching authorities or newspapers that might use the information to attack the entire plantation system. Evidence so comprehensive and damning that traditional cover-up methods would prove inadequate was what they discovered: the systematic nature of Evangeline's cruelty, the involvement of other plantation owners in planning similar programs, and the detailed documentation left behind by the Whitfield family created risks that extended far beyond damage to individual reputations. The fundamental legitimacy of the plantation system itself was what this threatened. What they called total narrative control, a coordinated effort involving local law enforcement, regional newspapers, and political authorities at both state and federal levels, was the decision made to implement. That Evangeline Ashworth had been killed during a random slave uprising that was quickly suppressed with the perpetrators captured and executed to prevent similar incidents from occurring elsewhere would be the official story. But eliminating all evidence of the experimental program, including everyone who had knowledge of what had actually occurred, was required for creating a believable alternative narrative. Over the following weeks, a systematic campaign of intimidation, bribery, and elimination would be implemented to ensure that no one who had witnessed evidence of Evangeline's activities would be willing or able to share that information with outside authorities. However, in ways they could not have anticipated, their efforts to suppress the truth were already failing. The Whitfield family had not simply escaped to freedom. They had established contact with abolitionist networks that enabled them to provide detailed intelligence about plantation vulnerabilities throughout the region. In the offices of anti-slavery newspapers throughout the North, unsigned letters began appearing by late April, containing information that could only have come from someone with intimate knowledge of both the plantation's operations and the subsequent cover-up efforts. Documentation that supported their arguments about the inherent brutality of the slavery system while simultaneously inspiring enslaved individuals throughout the South who learned that systematic resistance was possible even under the most oppressive conditions was provided to abolitionists by these revelations. A symbol of successful rebellion became the Ashworth incident, and maintaining control over plantation populations required increasingly expensive security measures that strained financial resources already damaged by the scandal. Effectively ostracized from the social and business networks that formed the foundation of plantation society, had Colonel Bogaud Ashworth been by autumn 1848. Loans were called in by banks, immediate payment for goods traditionally purchased on credit was demanded by merchants, and excuses to avoid association with someone whose name had become synonymous with scandal and failure were found by former allies. When comprehensive evidence of the experimental program reached federal authorities in Washington, forcing a congressional investigation that would expose the network of plantation owners who had participated in planning similar torture programs, came the final blow. That would complete the destruction of his family's 3-generation legacy was the decision made by Bogaud Ashworth rather than face public testimony about his role in his wife's activities. On December 15, 1848, he confessed the full truth about Evangeline's experimental program and his own knowledge of her systematic torture methods. But far more than he intended was revealed by his confession, including details about the Whitfield family's resistance that demonstrated their escape had been part of a far more sophisticated operation than anyone had suspected. A symbol of how systematic cruelty designed to break human spirits had instead forged them into something far more dangerous than compliant workers became the abandoned Ashworth plantation. Into strategic thinkers whose understanding of the plantation system's vulnerabilities enabled them to strike back in ways their tormentors never anticipated had the 7 people who had endured months of scientific torture been transformed. Only foundation stones mark where the Ashworth mansion once stands today. But far beyond the destruction of a single family's fortune extends the true legacy of this story. It serves as a reminder that the greatest horrors in human history often emerge not from supernatural forces, but from the calculated decisions of educated, respectable people who convince themselves that some lives matter less than others. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed, or do you think there are still secrets buried in the Georgia archives? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more dark mysteries like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves untold stories from America's shadows. Waiting to be uncovered, the past holds many more secrets.